Miss Marple and the Blue Geranium that predicted death, Chapter 1. The Garden Party Prophecy. The September afternoon cast golden shadows across the manicured lawns of Greenway House, where Mrs. Dolly Bantry had organised what she proudly declared would be the most splendid garden party Little Hemlock has seen this decade. The village's most prominent residents had gathered beneath striped marquees, their conversations punctuated by the gentle clink of teacups and the occasional burst of laughter. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a wicker chair near the prize-winning rose garden, her knitting needles moving with practiced precision. Her pale blue eyes, sharp despite her 70-odd years, observed the social tableau with the same careful attention she might give to a particularly intricate Fair Isle pattern. She had learned long ago that the most interesting human dramas often unfolded not in drawing rooms or libraries, but in the seemingly innocent gatherings where people felt safe to reveal their true natures. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry's voice carried across the lawn as she approached with her usual theatrical flourish. "I do hope you're enjoying yourself. Have you seen my new garden feature, the fortune-telling tent by the lily pond?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with a gentle smile. "How delightful, my dear. Though I must confess, I've always found that people reveal far more about their futures through their present actions than any crystal ball might suggest." Mrs. Bantry laughed, though there was a slight edge to it. "Oh, but you must try it. Madame Zelda, she's actually Mrs. Pemberton from the village, you know. But she's put on the most marvellous costume. She's been telling the most extraordinary fortunes. Why, she told Colonel Weatherby that he'd receive unexpected news before sunset. And wouldn't you know, the postman delivered a letter from his nephew in India not an hour later." Indeed, Miss Marple's tone was politely interested, though she had noticed the postman's arrival and Colonel Weatherby's obvious anticipation as he checked his pocket watch repeatedly throughout the afternoon. Near the refreshment table, a small commotion was developing. Dr. Geoffrey Humbleby, the village physician, stood in animated conversation with the local magistrate, Sir Henry Clithering, their voices carrying more urgency than the occasion seemed to warrant. "I tell you, Henry, it's most irregular," Dr. Humbleby was saying, his usually composed demeanour showing cracks of concern. 3 cases of severe gastric distress in the past fortnight, all presenting with similar symptoms. Mrs. Tremlett from Rose Cottage, young Timothy Forsyth, and now Mrs. Copley is complaining of the same peculiar burning sensation. Sir Henry adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. "You suspect something more than coincidence? In a village this size? When have we ever seen such a cluster of identical symptoms? And the curious thing is, each patient mentioned seeing blue geraniums in their garden just before falling ill." "Blue geraniums, Henry? They don't occur naturally." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. Blue geraniums were indeed unusual. She had noticed them herself in various cottage gardens over the past weeks, their unnatural azure blooms standing out like false notes in an otherwise harmonious composition. Chump! Across the lawn came a sudden shriek that cut through the genteel afternoon atmosphere like a blade through silk. All conversation ceased as heads turned toward the fortune-telling tent, where Madame Zelda, or rather, Mrs. Pemberton, stood in the entrance, her theatrical costume dishevelled, one hand pressed to her throat. She's dead!" Mrs. Pemberton gasped, her carefully cultivated mystical accent abandoned in her shock. "Mrs. Copley! She's collapsed in the tent and I can't rouse her." As Dr. Humbleby rushed toward the tent and chaos erupted around the garden party, Miss Marple quietly observed each reaction, already sensing that the afternoon's tragedy was far from random. The blue geraniums, she suspected, were about to reveal their deadly secret. Chapter 2. Gossip and Theories. By the following morning, news of Mrs. Copley's sudden death had spread through Little Hemlock like wildfire through dry grass. Miss Marple, making her customary early walk to the village shops, found herself witness to a dozen different theories, each more dramatic than the last. "Mark my words," declared Mrs. Price, the postmistress, as she sorted the morning mail with unnecessary vigour. It was those fortune-telling shenanigans. Dabbling in the occult never did anyone any good. Poor Mrs. Copley probably received a shock that stopped her heart. Mrs. Tremlett, still pale from her own recent illness, shook her head vigorously. "Nonsense! It was something she ate. I felt the same symptoms myself just last week. That dreadful burning sensation, the nausea. Something's contaminated in the village, mark my words." "But the blue geraniums," interjected young Timothy Forsyth, who worked as a clerk for the local solicitor. "We all saw them, didn't we? In our gardens just before falling ill. Surely that can't be coincidence." Miss Marple purchased her weekly provisions while listening to the debate with apparent absent-mindedness. But her attention sharpened when Mrs. Bantry arrived, looking thoroughly flustered. "Oh, Miss Marple! Thank goodness you're here. The police inspector from Much Benham is coming this afternoon to investigate. Inspector Slack, dreadful name, isn't it? He's already asking the most impertinent questions about my guest list. As if I would invite anyone capable of murder." "Murder?" Mrs. Price's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Then it wasn't natural causes?" "Dr. Humbleby found evidence of poisoning," Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice dramatically. "Some sort of plant alkaloid, he thinks. Inspector Slack seems convinced it was deliberate." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How very distressing for you, my dear. I suppose the inspector will want to speak with everyone who attended yesterday's gathering." "Indeed, and he's particularly interested in anyone who might have had disagreements with poor Mrs. Copley." Mrs. Bantry's voice dropped further. "Between you and me, there were several people who weren't entirely fond of her." As if summoned by the mention of conflicts, Mr. Arthur Carmichael entered the shop. The village's self-appointed moral guardian had the lean, disapproving look of a man who found fault with most of his neighbour's activities. "Terrible business," he announced to the shop at large. "Though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. Mrs. Copley had been making enemies left and right with her meddling ways." "Arthur," Mrs. Bantry protested, "that's hardly appropriate." "Appropriate or not, it's true. She'd been asking awkward questions about the parish finances, questioning my management of the church renovation fund. Last week she actually suggested an audit might be in order." His thin face flushed with indignation. Mrs. Tremlett bristled. Well, she wasn't wrong to ask questions. Some of us have noticed discrepancies. "There are no discrepancies," Mr. Carmichael snapped. "Every penny has been accounted for. Mrs. Copley simply didn't understand proper bookkeeping procedures." Miss Marple observed this exchange with interest. Financial disputes were often at the heart of village murders, and Mr. Carmichael's defensive attitude suggested Mrs. Copley's questions had struck uncomfortably close to the truth. "Of course," continued Mrs. Bantry, "there was also that unpleasant business with Mr. Rayburn." The mention of this name caused a noticeable hush in the shop. James Rayburn was the village's newest resident, a mysterious gentleman who had purchased the old mill house 6 months earlier. Handsome and charming, he had quickly become the subject of considerable female interest and male suspicion. "What business with Mr. Rayburn?" asked Mrs. Price eagerly. "Well," Mrs. Bantry glanced around to ensure she had everyone's attention. Mrs. Copley had been spreading rumours that he wasn't quite what he seemed. She claimed to have seen him receiving visitors at odd hours, conducting what she called suspicious business transactions. Timothy Forsyth shifted uncomfortably. That's all speculation, though, isn't it? Mr. Rayburn's always been perfectly pleasant to me. Pleasant, yes, said Mrs. Tremlett darkly. But what do we really know about him? Where he came from? What he did before arriving here? And those expensive motor cars that visit him? Who drives them? And why do they always come after dark? Miss Marple made a mental note to observe Mr. Rayburn more carefully. In her experience, mysterious newcomers to small villages often harboured secrets worth killing to protect. As the morning wore on, she learned that the list of people who had quarrelled with Mrs. Copley was longer than might be expected for such a small community. The deceased had apparently possessed an unfortunate talent for discovering others' secrets, and an even more unfortunate inclination to share her discoveries. There was Dr. Humbleby himself, whose medical practice Mrs. Copley had publicly criticised after her own treatment for a minor ailment had been less effective than she'd hoped. There was Mrs. Pemberton, whose role as Madame Zelda had been exposed by Mrs. Copley's loose tongue just days before the garden party. And there was Colonel Weatherby, whose gambling debts Mrs. Copley had somehow learned about and mentioned to several other villagers. By noon, Miss Marple had heard enough to understand that Mrs. Copley's murder would not lack for suspects. The question was not who might have wanted her dead, but who had possessed both the opportunity and the specific knowledge required to cultivate those mysterious blue geraniums and use them as an instrument of death. Chapter 3. The Inspector Arrives Inspector. Slack proved to be exactly as his name suggested, a man of average height and slovenly appearance, who gave the impression of preferring quick solutions to complex problems. He established his headquarters in the village hall and began interviewing witnesses with the methodical enthusiasm of someone checking items off a grocery list. Miss Marple happened to be arranging flowers in the church next door when she observed his arrival. Through the windows, she could see him gesturing impatiently as Sir Henry Clithering attempted to brief him on the village's social dynamics. 3 previous cases of similar poisoning symptoms, Inspector Slack was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the churchyard. All recovered, but with the same gastric distress, and all 3 victims mentioned seeing blue geraniums before falling ill. Obviously, we're dealing with a systematic poisoner who finally succeeded in administering a fatal dose. But, Inspector, Sir Henry protested, the blue geraniums appeared in the victims' own gardens. How could someone guarantee they would notice them? Simple enough to arrange, I should think. A midnight visit, plant the flowers where they're sure to be seen, then wait for the right opportunity to administer the poison. The flowers were just a signature, a way of marking the targets. Miss Marple found this theory rather unsatisfying. In her experience, murderers who took the trouble to leave signatures were usually motivated by something more personal than Inspector Slack's mechanical approach suggested. She was still pondering this when Mrs. Bantry hurried into the church, looking quite distraught. Oh, Miss Marple, that dreadful inspector has been questioning everyone as if we're all criminals. He seems particularly suspicious of Mr. Rayburn, simply because the man is new to the village, and the way he spoke to poor Colonel Weatherby about his financial difficulties, I thought the Colonel might have apoplexy. I imagine it must be very distressing, Miss Marple said gently. Has the inspector formed any specific theory about the method of poisoning? Something about the refreshments at the garden party being tampered with, but that's impossible. I supervised the preparation myself, and Mrs. Copley only had tea and a cucumber sandwich, the same as everyone else. Besides, she was perfectly well when she entered the fortune-telling tent. This detail struck Miss Marple as significant. If Mrs. Copley had been poisoned at the garden party, the symptoms would have manifested quickly, given the apparent potency of the toxin. But she had seemed perfectly normal until her final moments in the tent. "Tell me, my dear," Miss Marple said, "did Mrs. Copley consume anything else while she was having her fortune told?" Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. "I don't believe so. Though now that you mention it, Mrs. Pemberton did mention something about Mrs. Copley asking for a glass of water. Said she felt a bit faint from the heat in the tent." "And where did this water come from?" "Oh, from the pitcher Mrs. Pemberton kept in the tent for her own use. She suffers from a weak throat, you know, and finds all that mystical talking rather trying." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. If the water in the tent had been poisoned, it suggested that Mrs. Copley had been specifically targeted, rather than being the random victim of a systematic poisoner. But why would Mrs. Pemberton poison someone in her own tent, using her own water pitcher? The answer, she suspected, lay in understanding the connections between all the people who had been affected by the mysterious blue geraniums. There was a pattern here, but it was more subtle than Inspector Slack's heavy-handed investigation was likely to uncover. That evening, Miss Marple took a constitutional walk through the village, her route carefully planned to take her past the gardens where the blue geraniums had appeared. In each case, she noted, the flowers had been planted in prominent positions where the residents could not have failed to notice them. But more importantly, she observed that each garden showed signs of recent disturbance, not the sort that would result from casual late-night planting, but evidence of someone who was intimately familiar with gardening practices. At Mrs. Tremlett's cottage, the soil around the geraniums had been carefully composted and mulched. At the Forsyth house, the flowers had been planted in a spot that received optimal morning sunlight. And at Mrs. Copley's own cottage, the blue geraniums formed part of an elaborate colour scheme that complemented the existing plantings. This was not the work of a random poisoner making midnight visits, but of someone with genuine horticultural knowledge and legitimate access to these gardens. Someone the victims trusted enough to allow into their private spaces. Someone whose interest in their gardens would seem perfectly natural. Miss Marple smiled to herself as the pieces of the puzzle began to arrange themselves in her mind. The blue geraniums were indeed a signature, but not in the way Inspector Slack imagined. They were a message, a warning that the sender fully expected the recipients to understand. Now she merely needed to determine who in little. Hemlock possessed both the gardening expertise and the personal knowledge of the victims required to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme. Chapter 4. The obvious suspect by the third day of the investigation, Inspector Slack had clearly identified his prime suspect. Mr. James Rayburn's mysterious background, combined with Mrs. Copley's vocal suspicions about his activities, had convinced the inspector that the newcomer was responsible for the poisoning. Miss Marple encountered the inspector outside Rayburn's mill house, where a thorough search was underway. Several constables were examining the extensive gardens surrounding the property, while others investigated the various outbuildings that had once housed the mill's operations. "Found something interesting, Inspector?" Sir Henry Clithering inquired, as he joined the small crowd of villagers who had gathered to watch the proceedings. "Indeed we have," Inspector Slack replied with evident satisfaction. "Mr. Rayburn has an impressive collection of botanical books, including several volumes on plant toxicology. More significantly, we've discovered evidence of recent horticultural activities, unusual varieties of plants, specialized growing equipment, and what appears to be a makeshift laboratory in one of the outbuildings." Miss Marple observed Mr. Rayburn himself, who stood watching the search with an expression of resigned amusement rather than the guilt or panic one might expect from a cornered murderer. He was a man in his 40s, well-dressed and articulate, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with skeptical authorities. "I suppose it's natural for you to be suspicious of a newcomer," Rayburn said calmly. "But I assure you, Inspector, my interest in plants is purely academic. I'm a botanist by training, and I've been researching the cultivation of rare varieties for a book I'm writing." "A convenient explanation," Inspector Slack replied coldly, "though it doesn't explain why Mrs. Copley should have felt it necessary to investigate your activities so thoroughly." For the first time, Rayburn's composure showed a crack. Mrs. Copley was an unusually inquisitive woman. She seemed to believe that anyone who valued privacy must be hiding something criminal. "And were you hiding something, Mr. Rayburn? Nothing that would interest the police, I assure you." Miss Marple found this exchange illuminating, though perhaps not in the way Inspector Slack intended. Rayburn's responses suggested a man with secrets, certainly, but not necessarily murderous ones. His reaction to questions about Mrs. Copley indicated personal annoyance rather than the cold calculation required for systematic poisoning. Moreover, there were practical problems with the inspector's theory. If Rayburn was the poisoner, how had he gained access to the other victims' gardens? Mrs. Tremlett lived alone and was notably suspicious of strangers. Young Timothy Forsyth lived with his elderly mother, who rarely left visitors unattended, and Mrs. Copley herself had been highly vocal about her distrust of the newcomer. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if I might make an observation?" Inspector Slack turned to her with barely concealed impatience. "Yes, Miss Marple, I was merely wondering about the blue geraniums themselves. They're quite unusual, aren't they? Not the sort of plant one could simply purchase from an ordinary nursery. What of it?" "Well, I've been doing a bit of reading myself. I do so enjoy gardening magazines, and it seems that blue geraniums require very specific growing conditions and quite specialized knowledge to cultivate successfully. They're actually a hybrid variety, created through careful crossbreeding over several seasons." Inspector Slack looked puzzled. "Are you suggesting Rayburn couldn't have grown them?" "Oh, I'm sure Mr. Rayburn has the expertise," Miss Marple replied with a sweet smile. "But I wonder whether he's had the time. After all, he's only been in the village for 6 months. Creating a new plant variety typically requires at least 2 full growing seasons, sometimes more." This observation caused a moment of uncomfortable silence. Finally, Sir Henry cleared his throat. "Miss Marple makes an excellent point, Inspector. If the geraniums were locally grown, they must have been started well before Mr. Rayburn's arrival in Little Hemlock." Inspector Slack's face reddened slightly. Perhaps he brought them with him, or had an accomplice prepare them in advance. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "though that would suggest quite an elaborate conspiracy, wouldn't it? Someone would have had to plan Mrs. Copley's murder more than a year ago. Identify Little Hemlock as the ideal location. Arrange for Mr. Rayburn to establish residence here, and coordinate the entire scheme. Rather complex for what appears to be a village dispute, don't you think?" As Inspector Slack struggled with this logic, Miss Marple excused herself and wandered toward the Mill House Gardens. The property was indeed impressive, with extensive cultivated areas showing clear evidence of expert care. But as she examined the plantings more closely, she noted something that reinforced her growing theory about the true murderer. The gardens were laid out with the systematic precision of someone accustomed to commercial horticulture rather than amateur gardening. The spacing between plants, the organization of varieties by growing requirements, the sophisticated irrigation system, all suggested professional expertise. This was not the work of an academic botanist dabbling in rare varieties, but of someone whose livelihood had depended on successful plant cultivation. More significantly, she noticed several empty beds that appeared to have been recently cleared, with traces of blue fertilizer still visible in the soil. Someone had indeed been growing blue geraniums here, but the timing of their removal suggested a hasty attempt to eliminate evidence after Mrs. Copley's death. As she contemplated these observations, Miss Marple became aware that she was not alone in the garden. Someone was watching her from behind a grove of apple trees, trying to remain hidden while observing her investigation. When she turned to look more directly, the figure retreated deeper into the shadows. But in that brief glimpse, she had seen enough to identify the watcher, and with that identification, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The blue geraniums had indeed been a message, but not the sort of threat Inspector Slack imagined. They had been a gardener's signature, left by someone who took pride in their horticultural achievements and couldn't resist claiming credit for their work, even in the context of murder. Now Miss Marple needed to set a trap that would expose the killer's pride and their guilt. Chapter 5. The Hidden Clue. The breakthrough came, as such things often did in Miss Marple's experience, through the most ordinary of village activities. She was visiting Mrs. Tremlett to inquire about the elderly woman's recovery when she noticed something that had escaped Inspector Slack's thorough but unimaginative investigation. "Oh, yes, I'm feeling much better now, thank you," Mrs. Tremlett said as she served tea in her small sitting room. "Though I must say, those blue flowers gave me quite a start when I first saw them. So unusual and appearing overnight like that." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, accepting her cup with a gentle smile. "I don't suppose you saw who planted them?" "Well, not exactly planted, if you understand me. But I did see someone tending to them the morning I first noticed them. Quite early it was, around dawn. I'm always up early these days, can't seem to sleep past 5 o'clock anymore." Miss Marple's attention sharpened, though her expression remained pleasantly conversational. How interesting. A dedicated gardener, obviously, to be working at such an hour. "Oh, yes, very dedicated. Knew exactly what they were doing, too. Checking the soil, adjusting the position of the plants. Even brought a little watering can to give them a proper drink. I thought it was quite thoughtful, actually." "Did you recognize who it was?" Mrs. Tremlett hesitated, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigor. "Well, yes, I did. But I assumed they'd asked permission, you understand. It wasn't until later, when all this dreadful business started, that I began to wonder." "Of course," Miss Marple said encouragingly. "It's only natural to assume good intentions from someone you know well." "Exactly. And they've always been so helpful with gardening advice. Last spring, when my roses weren't thriving, they suggested a new fertilizer that worked wonders. And they helped young Timothy's mother redesign her herb garden after her arthritis made the old layout too difficult to maintain." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. Someone with both the expertise to cultivate blue geraniums and a history of helpful involvement in multiple village gardens was a very specific type of person indeed. After leaving Mrs. Tremlett's cottage, she made a point of visiting Timothy Forsyth's mother, Mrs. Forsyth, under the pretext of inquiring about a church committee matter. Here, too, she found evidence of the same helpful gardener. "Oh, yes, they were wonderful about the herb garden," Mrs. Forsyth confirmed. "Drew up a proper plan and everything, showing me which plants would be easiest to reach and which ones needed special soil conditions. Even brought some of their own compost to improve the soil quality." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple observed. "I suppose they suggested the location for your blue geraniums as well." "Actually, yes," said that particular spot got just the right amount of morning sun and was sheltered from the evening winds. I thought it was a bit odd, planting them there without asking first. But they explained it was meant to be a surprise, a thank you for letting them help with the herb garden project. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The pattern was becoming clearer with each conversation. The mysterious gardener had cultivated relationships with the victims over months or even years, establishing themselves as a trusted advisor whose presence in these private gardens would never be questioned. They had used this access to plant their signature blue geraniums and presumably to administer the poison that had ultimately killed Mrs. Copley. But there was still the question of motive. Why these particular victims? What connected Mrs. Tremlett, Timothy Forsyth, and Mrs. Copley beyond their shared gardening enthusiast? The answer came to her as she walked past the village's small commercial district. There, prominently displayed in the window of Henderson's Hardware and Garden Supply, was a notice that had been posted for several weeks. Closing down sale. All stock must go. After 40 years serving Little Hemlock, Henderson's will close at the end of September due to unforeseen circumstances. Thank you to all our loyal customers. Miss Marple paused to read the notice more carefully, then pushed open the shop door. Inside, she found Mr. Walter Henderson himself, a man in his 60s with the weathered hands and keen eyes of someone who had spent decades helping others cultivate their gardens. "Miss Marple, how nice to see you. Looking for anything special before we close up shop?" "Actually, Mr. Henderson, I was rather curious about your closing. Such a shame. You've been such an important part of the village for so long." Henderson's expression darkened slightly. "Yes, well, sometimes circumstances force difficult decisions. I'd hoped to keep going for another few years, but—" He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Financial difficulties?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "You might say that, though it wasn't really about money, if I'm being honest. More about trust, you might say. Hard to run a business when people start questioning your integrity." Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting into a new configuration. "Oh dear, that does sound distressing. 3 of my best customers, Mrs. Tremlett, young Timothy's mother, and Mrs. Copley, they all started suggesting I'd been overcharging them, selling them inferior products, even shortchanging them on orders. Mrs. Copley was the worst of it. She actually convinced several other customers to demand refunds for work I'd done months ago. How troubling. And you felt these accusations were unfair?" Henderson's face flushed with anger. "Unfair? They were absolutely false. I've never cheated a customer in my life. But once word gets around a small village like this, well, you know how it is. People start to whisper, start to doubt. My reputation was ruined." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though her mind was racing. Here was the motive she had been seeking. Not a random pattern of poisoning, but a targeted attack against the specific individuals who had destroyed Henderson's livelihood. "It must have been particularly difficult," she said, "given your expertise with plants and gardening. Such knowledge, built up over decades." 40 years of it, Henderson said bitterly. "I knew every garden in this village, every customer's preferences, every plant that would thrive in their specific conditions. I could have grown anything, created varieties that would have made this village famous for its gardens. Instead," he gestured around the nearly empty shop, its shelves stripped of the tools and supplies that had once made it the heart of Little Hemlock's gardening community. "I suppose you'll be leaving the village once the shop closes?" Miss Marple asked. "What choice do I have?" There's nothing left for me here, though I must admit I'll miss some aspects of the work. I was particularly proud of some recent experiments with unusual flower varieties. Created some truly unique specimens that no one else in the county could match. Miss Marple smiled gently. Blue geraniums, perhaps? The question hung in the air between them for a long moment. Henderson's face went very still, and when he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple. Oh, I think you do, Mr. Henderson. You created those beautiful blue geraniums as a sort of calling card, didn't you? A way of showing off your expertise to the very people who had questioned your professional abilities. But they were more than just a signature. They were a warning, a way of letting your victims know that someone who understood plants far better than they did was about to demonstrate the deadly potential of that knowledge. Henderson said nothing, but his hands gripped the edge of the counter with white knuckles. The poison was administered gradually, wasn't it? Miss Marple continued conversationally. Small doses, probably in fertilizer or plant food that you recommended for their gardens. Just enough to cause illness, to frighten them, to make them understand what you were capable of. Mrs. Copley's death was probably not intended. Perhaps she received a larger dose than you planned, or perhaps her system was more sensitive than you anticipated. You can't prove any of this, Henderson said quietly. Perhaps not in a court of law, Miss Marple agreed. But then, I suspect you're already planning to disappear once the shop closes, aren't you? New name, new location, perhaps a fresh start somewhere that your reputation hasn't preceded you. Henderson stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. They destroyed everything I worked for, Miss Marple. 40 years of building a business, a reputation, a place in this community. All gone because of their lies and suspicions. I understand your anger, Mr. Henderson, but murder is never the answer to injustice, real or perceived. Murder. Henderson laughed bitterly. I never intended to kill anyone. I just wanted them to understand, to appreciate what they had lost when they turned against me. The blue geraniums were meant to be beautiful, a reminder of what I could create. The illness was meant to be temporary, a lesson about respecting expertise. Mrs. Copley's death, that was an accident. Miss Marple regarded him with a mixture of pity and resolve. Perhaps it was, Mr. Henderson, but the other poisonings were quite deliberate, weren't they? And if you hadn't been stopped, I suspect there would have been more victims before you were finished with your lessons. The admission hung between them like a confession, and Miss Marple knew that her theory had been confirmed. Now she needed to ensure that Inspector Slack understood the true nature of the case before Henderson could disappear into the anonymity of post-war England. Chapter 6. Secrets Revealed. Word of Henderson's imminent departure spread through the village with remarkable speed, as such news always did in small communities. By evening, Miss Marple noticed an unusual amount of activity around the garden supply shop, with several villagers making what appeared to be final purchases before the closure. Among these late customers was Mr. Arthur Carmichael, the self-appointed guardian of parish finances, who emerged from the shop carrying a large bag of what looked like gardening supplies. This struck Miss Marple as curious, since she had never observed Mr. Carmichael showing any particular interest in horticulture. Even more interesting was the brief conversation she witnessed between Henderson and Carmichael outside the shop. Both men appeared agitated, their voices raised in what seemed to be an argument, though she was too far away to make out the specific words. "Trouble in paradise?" observed Dr. Humbleby, who had approached from the opposite direction and noticed the same interaction. "It would appear so," Miss Marple replied. though I confess I'm rather surprised to see Mr. Carmichael patronizing Mr. Henderson's establishment, given the circumstances." Dr. Humbleby looked puzzled. "What circumstances?" "Oh, perhaps you haven't heard. It seems that several villagers, including Mrs. Copley, had been questioning Mr. Henderson's business practices. I understood that was part of the reason for his decision to close the shop." "Good heavens! I had no idea there were problems with Henderson's work. I've always found him quite reliable for medical supplies. He's one of the few local vendors who can procure the specialized chemicals I need for my laboratory work." Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this casual revelation. "Specialized chemicals, Doctor?" "Oh yes, nothing dramatic. Just some compounds that aren't readily available through normal medical supply channels. Henderson has connections with agricultural suppliers who carry things like plant alkaloids for research purposes. Quite helpful, actually, though I suppose I'll need to find new sources now that he's closing." "Plant alkaloids," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "The same type of compounds that might be found in, say, exotic plant varieties." "Precisely. In fact, Henderson mentioned just last week that he'd been experimenting with extracting compounds from some unusual flowers he'd been cultivating. Said he was interested in their potential medicinal applications. This information cast Henderson's activities in a new light. If he had been extracting alkaloids from his blue geraniums, he would have had a ready supply of the poison used to kill Mrs. Copley, but it also suggested that his claim about the death being accidental might not be entirely truthful. As Miss Marple pondered these implications, she noticed Inspector Slack approaching with his characteristic air of self-important urgency. "Miss Marple, Sir Henry said I might find you here. I've just received some very interesting information from London about our Mr. Rayburn." "Indeed, Inspector. It seems he's not quite the respectable botanist he claimed to be. According to Scotland Yard, he's been living under an assumed identity for the past 2 years. His real name is James Rothwell, and he's wanted for questioning in connection with a confidence scheme involving rare plant investments." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows politely. "How intriguing! And you believe this connects him to Mrs. Copley's murder?" "Obviously. The woman discovered his true identity and was threatening to expose him. He killed her to protect his secret." "But, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "if that were the case, why would he poison Mrs. Tremlett and young Timothy Forsyth as well? Had they also discovered his secret?" Inspector Slack looked momentarily nonplussed. "Well, perhaps they had. Or perhaps he was trying to create a pattern of random poisonings to disguise his real target." "Quite elaborate," Miss Marple observed, "though I wonder if you've considered an alternative explanation." Before Inspector Slack could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Weatherby, who appeared quite agitated. "I say, Inspector, I've just heard the most extraordinary thing. Henderson's been telling people he's leaving tomorrow morning, not at the end of the month, as originally planned. Seems he's had a sudden change of circumstances." Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged glances. A precipitous departure suggested that Henderson felt the investigation was getting uncomfortably close to the truth. "Where is Henderson now?" Inspector Slack demanded. "That's just it. No one seems to know. His shop is locked up tight, and Mrs. Price at the post office said she saw him loading a motorcar with luggage earlier this afternoon." Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of urgency. In her experience, when suspected murderers began making hasty departures, it usually meant they were either fleeing justice or preparing to eliminate additional witnesses to their crimes. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we should pay a visit to Mr. Henderson's residence immediately. There are aspects of this case that may be more urgent than we realized. Inspector Slack, still fixated on his theory about Rayburn Rothwell, seemed reluctant to pursue this new line of investigation. I really think we should focus our efforts on apprehending the real criminal. And who might that be? Interrupted a new voice. They turned to see Mr. Rayburn himself approaching, his expression a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "You, sir," Inspector Slack declared. "James Rothwell, wanted by Scotland Yard for fraud." Rayburn sighed. "Yes, Inspector, I am indeed James Rothwell. And yes, I was involved in some questionable business practices in London. But I came to Little Hemlock precisely to escape that life and start over. The last thing I would do is commit a murder that would inevitably bring official attention to my whereabouts. A likely story?" "Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted gently but firmly, "while Mr. Rothwell's past is certainly interesting, I believe our immediate concern should be the whereabouts of Mr. Henderson. You see, I've been doing a bit of investigating myself, and I've discovered some rather disturbing connections between Henderson and all 3 poisoning victims." She quickly outlined what she had learned about Henderson's grudge against Mrs. Copley, Mrs. Tremlett, and Mrs. Forsyth, and his access to both the victims' gardens and the specialized chemicals needed to create the poison. "Furthermore," she continued, "Dr. Humbleby has just informed me that Henderson has been extracting alkaloids from his experimental plants. If those plants included the blue geraniums, he would have had both the means and the opportunity to commit these crimes." Inspector Slack looked torn between his preferred theory and this new evidence. But why would Henderson leave his signature flowers if he were trying to conceal his involvement? "Pride, Inspector. In my experience, people who commit crimes often can't resist claiming credit for their cleverness, even when it endangers them. Henderson spent 40 years building a reputation as the village's premier gardening expert. Even when turned to murder, he couldn't resist demonstrating his superior horticultural skills." Colonel Weatherby, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, suddenly snapped his fingers. "By Jove, I've just remembered something. Henderson asked me yesterday about the best roads for travelling north from the village. Said he was planning a motoring tour of the Lake District, but he seemed particularly interested in routes that would avoid the main highways." "That settles it," Miss Marple declared. "Inspector, I believe Henderson is planning to flee tonight, but first I fear he may attempt to silence anyone else who might connect him to the poisonings. We must find him before he strikes again." Chapter 7. The Final Trap. Darkness fell over Little Hemlock. Miss Marple found herself in the unusual position of actively participating in a police manhunt, rather than merely observing from the sidelines. Inspector Slack, finally convinced by the mounting evidence against Henderson, had organized a search of the village and surrounding countryside. But Miss Marple had a different theory about where Henderson might be found. If he truly intended to flee, there were loose ends he would need to tie up first, particularly anyone who might have observed his activities too closely. "Inspector," she said as they gathered outside the village hall, "I believe Henderson may attempt to visit Dr. Humbleby tonight." "The doctor? Why?" "Because Dr. Humbleby mentioned that he has been purchasing specialized chemicals from Henderson for his research. If Henderson has been extracting poisons from his plants, the doctor might have inadvertently observed the process. And if Henderson is planning to disappear permanently, he won't want to leave behind anyone who could describe his methods to future investigators." Inspector Slack considered this logic and nodded grimly. "Right then. We'll post men around the doctor's residence and wait. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that a more subtle approach might be more effective. If Henderson sees obvious police surveillance, he'll simply move on to his next target. But if the house appears unguarded, you're suggesting we use Dr. Humbleby as bait? I'm suggesting we give Henderson the opportunity to reveal himself, while ensuring that the doctor is protected. Perhaps if I were to pay Dr. Humbleby a social call this evening, an elderly lady seeking medical advice, Henderson might assume the house is safe to approach. Inspector Slack looked sceptical, but Sir Henry Clithering, who had joined the discussion, nodded approvingly. Miss Marple has excellent instincts about these matters, Inspector, and Henderson is more likely to reveal himself if he doesn't suspect a trap. An hour later, Miss Marple found herself sitting in Dr. Humbleby's comfortable study, ostensibly seeking treatment for a minor ailment, but actually watching the garden through the window for signs of movement. The doctor, briefed on the true purpose of her visit, maintained the pretense of a routine consultation while keeping his own eyes alert for danger. You really think Henderson might attempt violence? Dr. Humbleby asked in a low voice. I think Henderson is a man who has already committed one murder and attempted 2 others, Miss Marple replied quietly. Such people often find it easier to continue killing than to risk exposure, and you represent a significant threat to his escape plan. They didn't have long to wait. Just after 9 o'clock, Miss Marple noticed a shadow moving among the trees at the bottom of the doctor's garden. Someone was approaching the house with obvious attempts at stealth, taking care to avoid the lighted windows. He's here, she whispered, and Dr. Humbleby moved to the telephone to signal Inspector Slack, who was waiting with several constables at the village hall. But Henderson proved to be more desperate and more dangerous than they had anticipated. Instead of attempting a subtle approach, he suddenly appeared at the French doors leading from the garden to the study, a heavy garden spade raised as a weapon. Dr. Humbleby, he said, his voice steady, but his eyes wild with the intensity of a cornered animal. I need you to come with me. There are some matters we need to discuss. Mr. Henderson! Dr. Humbleby rose from his chair, affecting surprise. Whatever are you doing in my garden at this hour? Don't pretend you don't know, Henderson snapped. You've been asking questions about those chemical compounds I supplied you, talking to people about extraction processes and plant toxins. You know exactly what I've been doing. Miss Marple remained very still in her chair, hoping that Henderson's attention would remain focused on the doctor. But her slight movement caught his eye, and he turned toward her with the expression of dawning recognition. Miss Marple, I should have known you'd be involved in this. You've been asking questions too, haven't you? Poking your nose into matters that don't concern you. I was merely curious about your beautiful blue geraniums, Mr. Henderson. Such unusual flowers. They must have taken considerable skill to develop. Despite the danger of the situation, Henderson's face showed a flicker of pride. 2 years of careful breeding and selection. Creating a truly blue geranium required understanding genetic principles that most amateur gardeners couldn't begin to comprehend. And the alkaloid content? Miss Marple asked conversationally, as if they were discussing a routine gardening topic. I imagine that was an unexpected benefit of your hybridization work. Henderson's grip tightened on the spade. You know too much, Miss Marple. Both of you know too much. Actually, Mr. Henderson, I think we know too little. For instance, I don't understand why you felt it necessary to kill Mrs. Copley, when your original plan seemed to involve only making the accusers ill enough to regret their actions. Because she wouldn't stop, Henderson burst out. Even after she felt the effects of the first dose, she kept spreading her lies, kept convincing people that I was a cheat and a fraud. She was going to destroy me completely unless I stopped her permanently. So you increased the dosage in her tea water at the garden party, Miss Marple said gently. She asked for water, complained about feeling faint. It was the perfect opportunity to administer a stronger dose than I'd used on the others, I thought. I thought it would just make her more seriously ill, perhaps hospitalize her. But her system couldn't handle it. And now you're planning to flee before the authorities discover your role in her death. Henderson nodded grimly. I would have been gone already, but I realized that Dr. Humbleby might be able to identify the specific compounds I'd used, and you, Miss Marple, seem to have pieced together more of the truth than is safe for either of us. I see, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, though I confess I'm puzzled by one aspect of your plan. If you kill Dr. Humbleby and myself, won't that simply draw more attention to your activities? Inspector Slack is already suspicious of your hasty departure. Henderson's face showed uncertainty for the first time. Inspector Slack is an idiot. He's convinced that Ravenfellow is responsible for everything. Perhaps, but there are others in the village who have noticed the connections between yourself and the poisoning victims. Colonel Weatherby, for instance, remembers your conversation about travel routes, and Mrs. Tremlett identified you as the person she saw tending the blue geraniums in her garden. As Miss Marple spoke, she heard the faint sound of footsteps on the gravel path outside. Inspector Slack and his constables finally responding to Dr. Humbleby's signal. Henderson heard them too, and his desperation became more pronounced. Then I have nothing left to lose, he said, raising the spade threateningly. If I'm going to hang for Mrs. Copley's death anyway, 2 more murders won't make any difference. Actually, Mr. Henderson, said a calm voice from the doorway, I think you'll find that 1 murder makes quite enough difference for a lifetime. Inspector Slack stood in the entrance to the study, flanked by 2 constables, all 3 men holding police revolvers trained on Henderson. Put down the weapon, sir, and step away from Miss Marple and Dr. Humbleby. For a moment, Henderson seemed to consider making a desperate final attack. But faced with 3 armed policemen, his shoulders sagged in defeat, and he let the spade fall to the floor. Walter Henderson, Inspector Slack announced formally, I arrest you for the murder of Mrs. Margaret Copley and the attempted murders of Mrs. Tremlett and Timothy Forsyth. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be given in evidence. As the constables secured Henderson and led him away, Miss Marple reflected that justice had been served, though she couldn't help feeling a touch of sympathy for a man whose professional pride had led him so far astray. In her experience, the deadliest criminals were often those who began with understandable grievances and gradually lost sight of the moral boundaries that separated justice from revenge. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Revelation. The following morning brought a kind of anticlimactic calm to Little Hemlock, as if the village were slowly awakening from a particularly vivid nightmare. Miss Marple found herself summoned to the village hall, where Inspector Slack was attempting to complete his official report and tie up the remaining loose ends of the case. "I must admit, Miss Marple," the inspector said with grudging respect, "your insights into Henderson's motives proved considerably more accurate than my own initial theories, though I still maintain that Rayburn, or Rothwell rather, deserves investigation for his fraudulent activities." "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "though I suspect you'll find that his crimes, while certainly worthy of attention, were purely financial in nature, rather different from Henderson's murderous revenge." Sir Henry Clithering, who had been present for Henderson's confession the previous evening, shook his head sadly. 40 years of honest business, only to throw it all away for the sake of wounded pride. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of nursing grievances. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though I confess I find the psychological aspects of the case rather fascinating. Henderson's use of the blue geraniums as a signature was particularly revealing." Inspector Slack looked puzzled. "How so?" "Well, you see, most criminals who leave signatures are motivated by a desire for recognition or fear. They want either to claim credit for their cleverness or to terrify their victims. But Henderson's flowers served a different purpose entirely. They were a form of professional communication." "Communication?" Miss Marple set down her teacup and leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more animated as she warmed to her explanation. "Consider the message Henderson was sending. He had been accused of professional incompetence by 3 specific customers who questioned his expertise and integrity. His response was to create something that demonstrated the full extent of his horticultural knowledge, a plant variety that no amateur gardener could possibly duplicate." "Sure do you?" "The blue geraniums were proof of his skills," Sir Henry said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Exactly. But they were also a warning. By placing them in his victims' gardens, Henderson was essentially telling them, 'You questioned my competence, but look what I can create that you cannot. You accused me of cheating you, but I have access to your most private spaces. You tried to destroy my reputation, but I possess knowledge that you cannot even comprehend.'" Inspector Slack frowned, but surely he must have realized that such distinctive flowers would eventually lead us back to him. "I don't think Henderson initially planned to commit murder," Miss Marple explained. "His original scheme seems to have involved making his accusers moderately ill, just enough to frighten them and demonstrate his power. The blue geraniums were meant to be calling cards, proof that their mysterious illness was not random, but the work of someone with superior botanical knowledge." "But Mrs. Copley's death changed everything," Sir Henry observed. "Precisely. Once she died, Henderson faced the prospect of a murder investigation that would inevitably uncover his activities. At that point, the blue geraniums became liabilities rather than assets, evidence that could connect him to all the poisoning incidents." Dr. Humbleby, who had joined them for the final discussion, nodded thoughtfully. That would explain why he seemed so eager to leave the village. He must have realized that any thorough investigation would reveal the connections between his grudges and the victims. "And it would also explain his desperation last night," Miss Marple added. "He knew that Dr. Humbleby's knowledge of plant alkaloids and my own observations about the gardening patterns made us dangerous witnesses to his methods." Inspector Slack made notes in his official report, then looked up with a question that had clearly been bothering him. "Miss Marple, how did you first become suspicious of Henderson? What made you focus on him rather than on the more obvious suspects like Rayburn?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "It was actually the blue geraniums themselves that pointed me in the right direction. You see, Inspector, I've been gardening for more than 50 years, and I know how difficult it is to create genuinely new plant varieties. When I realized that the flowers must have been cultivated locally over multiple growing seasons, I began to consider who in the village had both the expertise and the resources for such a project. Henderson was the obvious choice, Sir Henry said. More than that, he was the only choice. No one else in Little Hemlock possessed the necessary combination of professional knowledge, commercial facilities, and access to specialized materials. Once I identified him as the creator of the blue geraniums, everything else fell into place, including his motives. Dr. Humbleby added, "Yes." Henderson's bitter resentment toward the people who had questioned his professional integrity provided a clear reason for targeting those specific individuals, and his expertise with plant-based chemicals gave him both the means to poison them and the knowledge to do so in a way that would initially appear like natural illness, Inspector. Slack closed his notebook with a satisfied snap. "Well, Miss Marple, I must say your methods are rather unorthodox, but they certainly produced results. Henderson has confessed to everything. The poisonings, the creation of the blue geraniums, even his original plans to flee the country." "I'm pleased that justice has been served," Miss Marple replied, "though I must admit to feeling rather sorry for Henderson. His crimes were inexcusable, of course, but they grew out of very human emotions. Pride, professional identity, and the desire for recognition that had been denied to him." "Still," Sir Henry observed, "there's a lesson here about the importance of addressing grievances through proper channels rather than taking matters into one's own hands." Miss Marple nodded agreement, though privately she reflected that the lesson might be somewhat more complex. In her experience, most murders grew out of situations where people felt they had no legitimate recourse for addressing wrongs done to them. The tragedy was not that Henderson had felt aggrieved, but that his sense of injury had overwhelmed his moral judgment. As the official participants in the investigation prepared to leave, Miss Marple remained behind to help restore the village hall to its normal function. The tables and chairs needed to be rearranged, and the various notices and documents left by the police investigation required proper filing. It was quiet, mundane work, but it gave her time to reflect on the case and its implications. Little Hemlock would return to its normal rhythms soon enough. The gossip would fade, new scandals would emerge to capture the villagers' attention, and Henderson's garden supply shop would eventually be taken over by someone else, but the blue geraniums would remain in people's memories as a reminder that even the most peaceful communities could harbor deadly secrets, and that the line between professional pride and murderous revenge was thinner than most people liked to believe. Chapter 9. Aftermath and Reflection. 3 weeks later, Little Hemlock had largely returned to its normal state of genteel tranquility. Henderson's shop stood empty, its windows papered over with notices of foreclosure and public sale. The blue geraniums in the various village gardens had been quietly removed by their embarrassed owners, leaving only faint traces in the soil to mark where Henderson's deadly handiwork had bloomed. Miss Marple, resuming her routine morning walk to the village shops, observed these changes with the philosophical acceptance of someone who had witnessed many such cycles of scandal and recovery in small communities. Human nature, she had long ago concluded, was remarkably consistent in its capacity for both wickedness and resilience. "Miss Marple," called Mrs. Bantry, hurrying to catch up with her outside the post office. "I've just heard the most extraordinary news, that Mr. Rayburn, or Rothwell rather, he's staying in the village." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied with polite interest. "Yes. Inspector Slack returned from London yesterday and announced that while Mr. Rothwell is certainly guilty of some questionable business practices, He's agreed to make full restitution to his victims and pay a substantial fine. Apparently, his horticultural expertise is quite genuine, and he's been offered a position with the Royal Botanical Gardens to help settle his debts. Miss Marple smiled. How pleasant for him, and for the village, I should think. It would be a shame to lose someone with such extensive knowledge of plants, particularly now that Mr. Henderson's expertise is no longer available. Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. Exactly my thought. And between you and me, Mr. Rothwell has been absolutely charming about the whole dreadful business. He's offered to help anyone who needs gardening advice, completely free of charge. Says it's the least he can do after the village showed him such kindness during the investigation. This information struck Miss Marple as rather interesting, though not entirely surprising. In her experience, people who found themselves unexpectedly forgiven for past transgressions often responded with genuine attempts at redemption. As they parted ways, Miss Marple continued her walk past the various gardens where Henderson's blue geraniums had once bloomed. At Mrs. Tremlett's cottage, she noticed that the elderly woman had planted a cheerful display of yellow marigolds in the spot where the ominous blue flowers had appeared. The bright traditional blooms seemed to represent a conscious choice to replace mystery with familiarity, fear with comfort. At the Forsyth house, young Timothy was working in the garden under the supervision of his elderly mother, both of them clearly taking pleasure in the simple, honest work of tending ordinary vegetables and herbs. The herb garden that Henderson had helped design remained unchanged, but its association with attempted murder seemed to have faded into merely another aspect of the family's gardening history. Dr. Humbleby's residence showed perhaps the most significant change. The doctor had expanded his garden considerably, adding several new beds dedicated to medicinal plants. When Miss Marple paused to admire his work, he emerged from the house to greet her. "Miss Marple!" Perfect timing. I was just about to take a tea break. Would you care to join me? As they settled in his garden with their cups, Dr. Humbleby gestured toward his new plantings. "I've been thinking a great deal about Henderson's case, you know. It occurred to me that his expertise with plant-based compounds might have been put to much better use if he'd focused on legitimate pharmaceutical applications rather than revenge, a constructive channeling of his knowledge." Miss Marple agreed. "Exactly. So, I've been corresponding with colleagues at several universities about the possibility of establishing a small research program here in Little Hemlock. Nothing elaborate, mind you, but perhaps enough to attract graduate students interested in studying the medicinal properties of local flora." Miss Marple found this development both admirable and slightly ironic. Henderson's murderous expertise would ultimately contribute to healing rather than harm, though he himself would never benefit from this transformation of his legacy. "Have you had any success in finding suitable researchers?" she asked. "As a matter of fact, yes. Mr. Rothwell has expressed considerable interest in participating once his legal difficulties are fully resolved. His background in both botany and chemistry makes him an ideal candidate, and his recent experiences have given him a deep appreciation for the importance of using such knowledge responsibly." As Miss Marple walked home that afternoon, she reflected on the various ways in which the village was processing and recovering from its recent trauma. Henderson's crimes had certainly disrupted the community's sense of safety and trust, but they had also catalyzed positive changes that might not have occurred. Otherwise, Mr. Rothwell's decision to remain in Little Hemlock and contribute his expertise to legitimate research represented one form of redemption. Dr. Humbleby's expansion of his medical practice to include botanical research suggested another. Even Mrs. Bantry's enthusiastic acceptance of the reformed confidence man demonstrated the village's capacity for forgiveness and renewal, but perhaps the most significant change was less visible and more subtle. The residents of Little Hemlock had been forced to confront the reality that their peaceful community could harbour deadly secrets, that their neighbours might possess hidden grievances capable of motivating murder. This knowledge would make them more cautious in their relationships, more aware of the potential consequences of their actions toward others. Whether this increased awareness would ultimately make the village safer, or simply more suspicious, remained to be seen. In Miss Marple's experience, communities that had weathered serious crimes often developed a kind of collective wisdom about human nature, becoming more perceptive about the warning signs of trouble while also more compassionate toward those struggling with difficult circumstances. She reached her cottage and settled into her favourite chair with her knitting. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at the case's resolution. Justice had been served, the innocent had been protected, and the community had demonstrated its resilience in the face of adversity. The blue geraniums were gone, but their brief, deadly bloom had taught Little Hemlock valuable lessons about trust, forgiveness, and the complex motivations that drove human behaviour. In the end, perhaps that knowledge would prove more valuable than any garden display, however beautiful or exotic it might have been. Outside her window, the autumn light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the village's peaceful streets. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries, and new opportunities for both kindness and wickedness to reveal themselves in the endless drama of human nature. But for now, Miss Marple was content to sit quietly with her needles and yarn, observing the world with the patient wisdom of someone who understood that the most important truths about people were usually hidden in the smallest, most ordinary details of their daily lives. Chapter 10. The Final Thread. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, Miss Marple found herself once again walking through the village of Little Hemlock. The seasons had changed, and with them, the last visible traces of the blue geranium case had finally disappeared. New flowers bloomed in the gardens where Henderson's deadly signatures had once grown, and the village had settled into a rhythm of life that seemed more genuine and less fragile than before. The morning brought unexpected news in the form of a letter delivered by the postman, a communication from Inspector Slack, who had been promoted following his successful resolution of several cases, including the Henderson investigation. "My dear Miss Marple," the letter read, "I thought you would be interested to learn that Walter Henderson died in prison last week. Natural causes, according to the medical examiner. His heart simply gave out." The prison chaplain mentioned that Henderson had been working in the prison garden, teaching other inmates about horticulture, and apparently finding some measure of peace in honest cultivation. He left behind detailed notes about his plant breeding experiments, which the authorities have turned over to the Royal Botanical Gardens for legitimate research purposes. Perhaps some good will come of his knowledge after all. Miss Marple set the letter aside and continued her walk, contemplating this final chapter in Henderson's story. Death had claimed him before the full legal consequences of his crimes could be imposed, but it seemed he had used his remaining time to return to the constructive aspects of his expertise rather than dwelling on the destructive applications that had brought about his downfall. At the sight of Henderson's former shop, she was pleased to see evidence of new life. A bright sign announced the establishment of Little Hemlock Community Gardens, and through the windows she could see that the interior had been converted into a combination greenhouse and educational centre. Several villagers were working inside, tending seedlings and consulting reference books with the concentrated attention of serious students. "Miss Marple," called a familiar voice. She turned to see Mr. Rothwell approaching, his arms full of gardening supplies and his face showing the healthy outdoor complexion of someone who spent his days working with plants. "Rather than plotting financial schemes, Mr. Rothwell," she replied with a genuine smile. "How pleasant to see you. I trust your research is progressing well." "Better than I dared hope," he replied enthusiastically. "Dr. Humbleby and I have identified 3 local plant species with promising pharmaceutical applications, and we've been accepted into a university consortium studying traditional botanical medicine. More importantly, we've trained a dozen village residents in proper plant identification and cultivation techniques, including some of Henderson's former customers, I imagine." Rothwell's expression became more serious. "Yes, including Mrs. Tremlett and Mrs. Forsyth." Both women were initially reluctant to participate, understandably, given their experiences, but they've proven to be remarkably dedicated students. Mrs. Tremlett, in particular, has a genuine talent for recognizing subtle differences in plant varieties. Miss Marple found this development both touching and appropriate. The women who had been victimized by Henderson's perverted expertise were now acquiring genuine botanical knowledge that would protect them from future deception while enabling them to contribute to legitimate research. As she continued through the village, Miss Marple encountered other signs of positive change. Colonel Weatherby had established a small scholarship fund to help local young people pursue educational opportunities in agriculture and medicine. Mrs. Bantry had organized regular socials, gatherings designed to strengthen community bonds and encourage open communication about problems before they could fester into more serious conflicts. Even Mrs. Pemberton, the former Madame Zelda, had found a constructive outlet for her theatrical tendencies by organizing educational presentations about local history and folklore. Her performances were still dramatic, but they now served to educate rather than exploit the villagers' curiosities about the future. The most significant change, however, was less tangible, but more profound. The residents of Little Hemlock seemed to interact with each other more thoughtfully, more aware of the potential consequences of their words and actions. The casual gossip and careless accusations that had contributed to Henderson's murderous resentment had been replaced by more careful consideration of how criticism and suspicion might affect their neighbors. This didn't mean the village had become artificially polite or that genuine concerns were being suppressed. Rather, people seemed to have learned the difference between constructive criticism and destructive gossip, between justified suspicion and harmful rumor-mongering. As Miss Marple made her way back toward her cottage, she reflected on the complex lessons of the blue geranium case. Henderson's crimes had certainly been inexcusable, but they had grown out of very human emotions and very real injustices. His customers' accusations about his business practices had apparently been based on misunderstandings and unrealistic expectations rather than genuine fraud. But their public criticism had nevertheless destroyed his reputation and livelihood. Yoshisuke. Tragedy was not that conflicts had arisen. Such disputes were inevitable in any community, but that no one had taken the trouble to investigate the accusations thoroughly or to provide Henderson with a fair opportunity to address the concerns about his work. The spiral of suspicion and resentment that had ultimately led to murder might have been prevented by more careful attention to the principles of justice and due process. In the end, the blue geraniums had served as more than just a murderer's signature. They had been a complex symbol of the relationship between expertise and recognition, between professional pride and personal dignity, between the desire for respect and the willingness to earn it through honest effort. Henderson had created something genuinely beautiful and scientifically valuable in his hybrid geraniums, but his decision to use them as instruments of revenge had transformed their beauty into an emblem of death. Now, through the work of Rothwell, Dr. Humbleby, and their student volunteers, Henderson's botanical knowledge was being channeled toward healing and education rather than harm. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate to admire her own modest flower beds, where traditional roses, delphiniums, and sweet peas bloomed in harmonious profusion. There were no exotic hybrids here, no scientific breakthroughs or horticultural innovations, just the simple pleasure of tending ordinary plants with care and patience. But in their own quiet way, these familiar flowers represented the same principles that the community of Little Hemlock was learning to embrace. That true beauty came from honest effort, that lasting satisfaction was found in constructive work, and that the greatest achievements were often the result of cooperation rather than competition. As she entered her cottage and settled once again into her favorite chair, Miss Marple reflected that the blue geranium case would remain with her as one of the more complex and instructive mysteries she had encountered. It served as a reminder that murder was rarely a simple matter of good versus evil, but rather the tragic result of human weaknesses and misunderstandings that, with wisdom and compassion, might have been resolved through better means. The afternoon light streaming through her windows illuminated the peaceful village beyond, where people were going about their daily lives with perhaps a slightly deeper understanding of both the fragility and the resilience of their shared community. The blue geraniums were gone, but their brief, deadly bloom had taught lasting lessons about the importance of truth, justice, and the careful cultivation of trust among neighbors. In the end, Miss Marple concluded, that might be the most valuable harvest of all from Henderson's tragic experiment in horticultural revenge. The village had learned not just who had committed murder, but how such crimes might be prevented in the future through greater attention to fairness, communication, and mutual respect. As the sun set over Little Hemlock, casting gentle shadows across the gardens, where new flowers bloomed in place of Henderson's ominous blue geraniums, Miss Marple picked up her knitting needles and began work on a new project. A comfortable shawl in cheerful yellow wool, bright and warm as spring sunshine, carrying no hidden messages beyond the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful and useful with patient, skillful hands. The mystery of the blue geraniums was finally completely solved.